In the early 18th century, Western civilization moved into a new period of growth. It was an age when society went from rural to urban, from agrarian to mechanized, from simple to complex. This was the Industrial Revolution. There are many reasons why the Industrial Revolution occurred. To help put those reasons into perspective, we have two scholars who specialize in its history. Professor Maxine Berg and Professor Margaret Jacob.
I like to think of something that wasn't just focused on transformations of technology or a major burst in economic growth, which is the way that many economic historians have written of the Industrial Revolution. I like to also include quite substantial changes in society, which took place over the course of the long 18th century. The period from early in the 18th century right through into the 1830s. That a whole century, in a sense, would be associated with the Industrial Revolution. And it's associated with a transformation from what was largely an agrarian society over into an urban society, and a society that could feed itself, produced enough food to feed itself, and produced a surplus to provide for consumption of a big broad range of the population.
The best way of defining the Industrial Revolution is to say that from roughly the 1760s to the 1860s, that's 100 years, in England, the wealth of the nation more than doubles, it triples. And you have a growth rate in place throughout many of those years of about 3 to 4 to 5% per annum.
English economic historian Arnold Toynbee first popularized the term Industrial Revolution when he used it to describe England's economic development during those 100 years. Since then, it's grown to mean much more, including the technological, socioeconomic, and cultural changes that rocked the world during that time. Nowhere were these changes more apparent than in Great Britain, where most historians agree the Industrial Revolution began.
And I think we really have to constantly be looking to Asia to explain the origins of the Industrial Revolution in Europe. We have to remember that the first city with 1 million people was Edo, Tokyo in Japan during the 18th century, and that was long before there was anything approaching a city of that size in Europe. Asia, India, China, Japan, these were places of extremely large cities. So the urban experience was one that was part of the long course of history. In Europe, we also had a lot of smaller cities alongside large agricultural, agrarian sectors. What we see happening in Britain is Britain setting itself apart, becoming something that was different than the experience in the rest of Europe.
I tend to belong to the school that sees the key as lying in technological advancement. And in this sense, I'm old-fashioned enough to point to the steam engine and say, yes, you can have, for example, in the late 18th century, there were pipe-making factories in the Netherlands where they turned out handmade 1 million pipes a year for distribution all over Europe. Is that part of the Industrial Revolution? No, it is not, because it's hand labor. And if you had been able to outfit such a factory with a steam engine that put in movable parts, if you could imagine such a thing. I mean, I don't know how you'd make a pipe out of moving parts the way you can weave cotton, for example. You could have trebled that production rate in a year.
One of the reasons put forward as to why the Industrial Revolution began in Britain is that it had an abundance of natural resources, especially in coal and iron ore. However, other European countries were also richly endowed in natural resources. The Netherlands was filled with peat, and Scandinavia had a lot of trees and water, as well as iron ore. The British were the first to develop the technology to exploit their natural resources and adapt them to large-scale production, and that certainly was a contributing factor. But it was not the only one.
If you believe that the key element in early industrial development is technological, then what you've got to try to answer, the big question becomes, why is there that kind of technological sophistication in England and nowhere else? Because this is true. By the 1790s in Manchester, for example, there are about 25 steam-driven cotton factories. Well, you won't see a steam-driven cotton factory in France until 1810. That's the very first one that's opened up. So you're forced back to saying, what is it about the English? And what I've argued in a book called Scientific Culture and the Making of the Industrial West is that scientific education, scientific knowledge, and understanding of machines and mechanisms had permeated more deeply and more widely in England than was the case anywhere else in the world. And I make this argument based on educational records, on scientific lecturing that occurs in towns and cities throughout the 18th century. There are more books being published that are textbooks in applied mechanics in England than anywhere else. There are more scientific lectures available. The curriculum of the schools is more scientifically oriented in England than is the case even in the Netherlands, which is one thinks of as an advanced, very rich country in this period, and certainly more than in France.
Another advantage England had at the time was the nature of social change it was experiencing.
This was a very urban society, and it was one where urban growth was very important over the course of the 18th century. And this didn't just mean the rapid growth of a metropolis like London, which did indeed grow very rapidly over the period. From 1700, a city of about 500,000, growing to nearly, well, close to 1 million by the early 19th century. What was much more important for the British was the development of a whole range of smaller and middle-sized towns and industrial and commercial towns. It was towns like Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, Sheffield, these towns that went with industry and commerce.
The people who lived in these cities came from all walks of life. They included the very poor as well as the extremely rich. But whereas these two classes came to dominate other European cities, in Britain there was also a substantial middle class.
When we talk about the middling classes in the 18th century, this is this whole group ranging from artisans through people in the trades, people in commerce, industry, the professions. They range over the whole of a very wide social spectrum. This is a society that is generating a lot of these people. They have a whole range of new consumer demands. They have a whole different approach to life than a society would, where we have a huge disparity in hierarchies and a huge disparity in incomes, say between an aristocracy and the poor.
As the population in the cities increased, the number of people in agriculture declined. A way had to be found for this smaller rural labor force to produce enough food to feed the country. That stimulated the need for agrarian reform.
Relatively to the rest of the population, this is a smaller rural labor force producing enough food to feed the country until nearly the end of the 18th century, when food starts to be imported on a bigger scale. But it was only started to be imported because the British, it was to the greater advantage of the British to put their resources to industry, to producing industrial output. And this labor force, this rural labor force, is able to produce this because of a series of changes in agricultural organization, how farms were organized and managed, and a series of what we would call technological innovations in agriculture. But they're really innovations in the types of food crops that were grown and the rotations in which these crop rotations. They were not really about mechanical technological changes until later on. And that was this big achievement in Britain. And this is an achievement that was admired enormously by other continental countries.
Up until the Industrial Revolution, farmers shared common pastures and fields. As the need for increased efficiency grew, these common lands were divided into compact private estates that were more easily farmed. The landlords rented their lands to tenant farmers, who then hired laborers to work their farms. This became known as the landlord-tenant system. Some landlords personally managed their estates, and some didn't. But in either case, they knew that their profits would be greater if the tenant farmers who applied the latest agricultural techniques ran the farms. Oddly enough, many of these techniques were introduced to a large extent from other parts of Europe.
The east coast of England, Norfolk and Suffolk, became a conduit, a route for introducing a whole series of root crops that the British really hadn't thought of much before, but a whole series of new seeds and plants were brought over from the Netherlands, from northern France, very important, and particularly the Netherlands, and other parts of Europe, and they're introduced into the crop rotations. The crops were rotated several times, and this allowed for the soil, gave the soil a rest. It gave the soil a chance of replenishing its nutrients with the introduction of a whole series of root crops. The famous one we think of is turnips, famous turnip Townsend sort of introducing the turnip, but it was just a symbol for a whole series of other kinds of root crops which introduced new nutrients into the soils. And also from Holland there were new methods of draining the soil and draining the land, and a whole series of other improvements which were introduced and applied.
18th century Britain was a wealthy country with a broad economic base well above subsistence. Not only did the demand for food rise, but also for manufactured goods. One of the stories frequently left out of the accounts of the Industrial Revolution is the part played by consumers.
I have to say I prefer a shopping theory of history. I mean, obviously, this has to become a story of fashion and style, and shopping and desire. The key initiator of this is the response of Europeans to new consumer goods which they'd never seen before, they'd never come across on a large scale, coming in on those ships coming, the great East India Company ships coming in from Asia, China, Japan, and India, and bringing with them cargo loads of wonderful silks, fantastic printed cotton goods, and porcelain. And this brought about an absolute transformation in the material cultures of not just the very rich, those were the only people who used to have access to these wonderful exotic goods.
The danger with the Industrial Revolution is to simplify it. Now, I've committed that sin in the sense that I've said, well, I think the key here is technological transformation. And yes, in some sense it is, but the reality is if there's nobody out there to buy what you are mass producing, you might as well all go home. And the fact is that there's enough money circulating in England, there are enough people interested in small consumption, buying everything from buttons to buckles to teapots to cotton fabric that can be made into a variety of things. The fact that you've got that kind of home market is immensely important in making industrialization possible in England.
As the population exploded, British manufacturers soon found out that the traditional methods of production could not keep pace with the increased demand for goods. They needed to develop ways to turn out products in mass and to do it cheaply. Technology and invention soon became the lifeblood of the Industrial Revolution.
During the later 17th and 18th century, Europeans discovered cotton and beautiful, fine, figured cotton, beautiful printed cotton, and muslins, etc., brought in from India. So it was the East Indian trade which produced, again, another amazing luxury good, which everybody wanted. And they either had to pay the prices that were being charged by the East India Company. Well, sometimes these weren't so high, but on the other hand, they were the imports were challenged by the woolen manufacturers, who were worried about losing their markets for woolen goods. So people looked for ways of producing these at home. How could we spin these beautiful fine cottons without masses of hand labor? And that was a challenge that was faced by and taken out by a number of inventive minds during this time.
Many of the patents inventors applied for back then were for things not usually associated with the Industrial Revolution. For example, a recipe for porcelain. The British had cultivated a passion for porcelain and tried hard to develop a product that would rival porcelain made by the Japanese and the Chinese, which at the time was the finest. But the inventions that had the greatest impact were in the manufacturing of textiles. James Hargreaves was a poor, uneducated British spinner and weaver. He was also an inventor. His spinning jenny could spin multiple spools of thread at one time.
The improvement that it offered was that it didn't just have one spindle, it had 10. So it meant that you could produce 10 times the output that a single hand spinner could produce. But if you can put 10 spindles on a jenny frame, you can put 100 on, or you can put 1,000 on. So these technologies were kind of on. It wasn't much of a leap to see that if you put these in not just a workshop but a factory, you could make amazing profits out of this.
Two other inventions that improved the speed of spinning thread were Richard Arkwright's water frame and Samuel Crompton's spinning mule, which produced high-quality thread and yarn. In 1733, John Kay's patented flying shuttle increased weaving speed and also tolerated the weaving of wider fabrics. And in 1785, an English clergyman by the name of Edmund Cartwright patented the first power-driven machine loom.
With textiles, the key becomes finding ways, and these ways are found by the 1760s, of taking the raw cotton, taking a bale of cotton that has literally been picked 6 months earlier by slaves in the Carolinas, put into a bale, put onto a ship, winds up in Manchester. You open that bale, And what the English have found are ways of making that cotton into thread by spinning it on machines of multiple moving parts. So they make the thread much more quickly. And then they've also found ways of taking a shuttle, and like a big needle almost, and slipping it through thread that's already been lined up and making cloth by machine. So, for example, by the 1820s, in Manchester, they were making cotton of the quality in the weave of what we today wear. That the weave was that tight, that smooth. So let me give you an example of what this means. There was in India a thriving cotton industry, workers spinning cotton and hand weaving cloth. By 1820, it became possible to export cotton from India, send it to Manchester, have it woven into cloth in the mechanized factories, sent back to India, and sold more cheaply than what the local Indian hand weavers could produce. And it destroyed the Indian cotton industry, just demolished in a decade.
Another invention that was key to the rapid development of the textile industry was the Watt steam engine. His wasn't the first steam engine, but his patent is the one that launched the Industrial Revolution. It replaced human, animal, and water power with a reliable, low-cost source of energy.
Now, for the first steam engines that were not introduced to substitute for water power, but to supplement water power. These were Newcomen reciprocating engines. What they did was that they could raise more water and pump that water more effectively to go over the water wheels. It was actually the water wheel that was turning the wheels of the textile machines. But they were supplemented by the steam engines. And the engines were also used extensively for pumping water out of the mines, out of copper mines in Cornwall first of all. They were used in coal mines. So there's a widespread use of these reciprocating engines, the Newcomen engine and variations on the Newcomen engine from early in the 18th century.
What's important here is that what figures out that the way to conserve energy is to have a separate condenser so that you've got two sites where the steam is you've got one site full of steam. So you don't have to take a single cylinder, cool it down, then refill it with steam, because that was enormously wasteful of time and energy.
The first Watt steam engines were used primarily to pump water out of copper and tin mines. It wasn't long when businessmen saw a market for steam power in other industries as well. They urged Watt to invent an engine that could bypass the water wheel and directly turn the wheels of industry.
If you think about how the steam engine goes, the beam goes like this. Well, the next important advance is to translate this horizontal motion into circular motion, and then you can bring that circular motion right into a factory. The cotton factory in Style, the quarry mill factory, is a perfect example. You can actually see the engine moving, the pipe coming up that translates that into circular motion, then the circular motion being led into the factory and coming down on belts that in turn moves these machines. So the key is rotary motion is very important.
The steam engine became the backbone of the modern factory. The use of steam power led, in turn, to increased demand for coal and iron. The production of iron played a significant role in the industrialization of Britain, as well as other parts of the continent.
We have a whole series of innovations in the iron industry in Britain in the 18th century, which makes it possible to produce iron on a huge scale, and to produce the kind of iron that would create the infrastructure for industry, for making machines, for building fireproof factories with iron-framed buildings.
For all of iron's benefits, it also had various disadvantages, the major one being its brittleness. This was overcome with the development of steel, which was stronger, more resilient, and more flexible. It wasn't that steel was new. In fact, it was used extensively through the 18th century in making luxury goods. But the refining process took quite a long time and required highly skilled workers. For steel to be profitable, a way had to be found to mass produce it. That was made possible in the mid-1800s when Henry Bessemer patented a revolutionary steelmaking process. Basically, steel is made by removing impurities from pig iron. This is done by melting the pig iron and then bringing the molten metal into contact with air. The Bessemer process basically speeds up this process by injecting air directly into the molten iron. Every new venture, like steelmaking, required enormous capital.
Yes, capital. You can't do anything without finance. You may have great ideas, but you've got to find a backer, or unless you're very rich yourself, you're not going to get very far with it. And I think the British were pretty creative over this and it suited the kind of industrialization that they had at the time. Remember, they were the first to industrialize, so everything was on a much smaller scale. It demanded much less capital than those countries that came along in the 19th century and started their industrial revolutions then. They were in a completely different ballpark.
In the 18th century, England and other parts of Europe were highly commercialized nations. They had been long engaged in global trade and had banking and credit instruments already in place. Lending and borrowing money was something that was natural to people.
The important thing to remember about the way capital is transformed in the 18th century is that the same people who make the money in commerce and trade in every kind of import, export, including slaves, these are not, on the whole, the same people who become inventors or industrialists. Instead, they are the people who loan the money to the people who become inventors and industrialists. So you have an interface between the commercial and the industrial that is made possible through the exchange of capital at, of course, interest-bearing rates. I mean, there's something here for everyone.
British banks spread across the country throughout the 18th century continued to oil the wheels of this new market economy. Some of them were founded by the industries themselves. One of the more famous was the Rothschilds Bank.
One of the Rothschild sons, Nathan Rothschild, had come to Manchester to engage in the trade in cotton goods, and then moves down to London, sets up a bank. And those merchant banks, a number of the early banks had very close industrial associations.
In addition to these large banks, there were all kinds of smaller regional banks, sometimes called country banks, that firms could turn to for capital. Unlike their big brothers that handled long-term lending, these banks usually dealt in short-term loans. They traded in what was one of the most widely used instruments of credit at the time, the bill of exchange, which was basically a promissory note or a kind of long-term check. In order for farmers and entrepreneurs to meet the growing demand for their goods, merely growing or manufacturing products wasn't enough. They also had to contend with getting those products to market.
A lot of the distribution centres were earlier focused on London, getting crops, getting things to the London market. This was it's the biggest city. It was a major domestic market. In the earlier 18th century, it was also the major exporting point in the earlier 18th century. If you were a producer of luxury goods, you had to get them to London if you wanted to get them sold, because even people in the region around you, the wealthy, the gentry, the wealthier middle classes, they didn't buy luxury goods from their local shops. They went to London to buy their luxury goods. one of the natural advantages they had was that they were this was an island, and a great deal could be transported up and down the coast. And the coastal trade was incredibly important in the 17th and the earlier 18th centuries. Coal was sent down the coast to London from Newcastle. Great Newcastle coal trade is sort of very much a sort of coasting trade. There's a coasting trade right round the country. But the next problem was how to get things from the middle of the country out to the coast. And this is where the canal systems came in.
The British canal system is the infrastructure of the first industrial revolution. Without it, you could not have gotten the coal out of the mountains and valleys and brought down to industrial sites where you've got water power available, or now you can use coal power. So the canal system is absolutely fundamental. And again, you can see the importance of scientific culture in the canal system. You're going to say, well, what kind of scientific knowledge do you have to build a canal? Surely anybody can dig a trench. This is true. But the trick in early canal building is to dig trenches and move water up and down over hilly terrain. And there you have to understand the basic principles of hydrodynamics and hydrostatics. So it requires an understanding that water has a weight, and that you require a certain amount of energy in order to lift that weight. And if you can't figure that out, you cannot build a canal over hilly terrain.
Another important development in transportation was the development of the steam locomotive. However, it wasn't until 1830 that the first steam train, the famous rocket, was built. Before that, rails had been used extensively in coal mining and other industries to move materials by means of horse-drawn wagons. Eventually, the steam engine was developed in ships as well. Though the story of the Industrial Revolution begins in Great Britain, it's impossible to tell it without including other important European countries that contributed to its expansion. Among them, Scandinavia, Belgium, France, Germany, and Italy. Among their biggest contributions was skilled labor.
And people in Britain, if they needed skilled labor, they had the knowledge networks to focus on this and to get people over. They knew where they could get the key skilled labor that they needed, and they set off to find it. And vice versa. The Europeans came over to Britain to recruit labor forces for the new industrial techniques that the British were developing. If they wanted to transfer them to other parts of Europe, they came here. And of course we have the extensive place played by the Scandinavians in the iron industry and the export of high quality iron at a crucial stage of the early Industrial Revolution. Rapid expansion of the cotton industry, and especially the application of steam power and the expansion of coal and iron production. This was an experience that was also shared, and there were many close connections between Britain and areas in northern France and Belgium. Now, Belgium was an early industrializer in Europe. It had the coal, it had early use of steam power, and the iron industry was rapidly developed there. And in addition to this, we have these areas of northern France where we see quite a rapid growth of the cotton industry, extensive use of steam power and application of steam power there as well.
With so many natural resources, one might have expected the birth of the Industrial Revolution to be in the German states. What was lacking in Germany at the time, however, was a social structure to support such a movement.
The first European producer of porcelain was the Meissen factory near Dresden. This was the first European porcelain factory, and they had found the recipe, found by an alchemist, but funded massively by Augustus the Strong, the Saxon ruler at the time. But this did not lead to industrialization, because again we have these courtly states with enormous social division between the rich and the poor, and between the aristocracy and the ordinary people. And it took some time before there was a kind of road to industrialization in Germany. But this becomes a story of German integration, the integration of the German states, and certainly later 19th century story, where we see then very rapid industrialization based initially in Prussia, Saxony, and then brought forward under Bismarck's unification.
The Industrial Revolution gradually made its way from continental Europe to North America. But once on our shores, it spread very quickly. Besides being richly endowed with natural resources, America's Puritan ethic, coupled with a belief in free enterprise, sparked technological innovation and economic growth.
American ingenuity was something that kind of arrived with the colonists, and it was one of the features of American industrialization that they had a lot of inventive, ingenious people who came over in the first waves of migration. It was a youthful population, and one that often came with skills that they could apply, and they applied these skills to a whole regime of new resource bases. A country with a lot of water power, a country with a lot of wood, and so we get this sort of famous American ingenuity arising, and everybody was out there inventing, creating new processes.
Many of America's early innovations were made in the textile industry. In the late 18th century, a textile worker from England by the name of Samuel Slater used copies of Arkwright's machine designs to open a cotton mill in Rhode Island. The industry grew with innovations like Eli Whitney's cotton gin, which vastly increased the supply of cotton fiber to the mills, and Cyrus McCormick's reaper, which revolutionized crop harvesting.
Well, there's many things about the American version of the Industrial Revolution that are similar and yet different from the British version. The American Industrial Revolution of the late 19th century is fed by the manufacturing of small items that can be sold to individuals or families. And in this sense, the greatest symbol, I think, of the American Industrial Revolution is the motor car, the Ford assembly plant. The assembly plant has in its infrastructure all the basic principles of any cotton factory. You have moving parts, horsepower drawn not from human hands but from machine power. You have division of labor, so that workers just work on a certain piece of it. And to assemble something that produces greater transportation for individuals and has a market built into it. And so you have a very market-driven or consumer-driven industrial revolution in the United States.
The Americans continue a very rapid rate of progress through the early 19th century, but the period of their real coming of age is the mid to the late 19th century, and that's where, I mean, it really was the 1851 exhibition in Britain, where the British realized they really did have a challenge over the water. The gun technologies that were brought over, a number of the new technologies that were on display at the Great Exhibition in 1851 showed that there was a real force there in the offing. And then we have the massive growth in population, urbanization, all these absolutely necessary bases for the rapid development of industry and technology.
With the exponential growth and prosperity and the countless testaments to human ingenuity, it's easy to romanticize the Industrial Revolution as a success story. However, for many people who lived through that time, it was a success story not without pain. With modernization came a price. One might say it was an example of taking 2 steps forward and 1 step backward.
The early cotton factories the din was just unbelievable. And in addition, the factory floor was made out of wood, and these machines themselves were wooden. And when all these machines started up, the sound and the motion, the vibration, was just body breaking. Similarly, the air was full of cotton dust. And these basic pollution problems that are environmental are inherent in industrial development. And the trick is to pull off industrial development and protect the environment.
Another problem brought on by these new technologies was pollution. People were crowded into industrial, mining, and iron-producing areas where fires from the various mills burned constantly, shrouding many cities in a black pall of smoke. Housing conditions were unsanitary and lacking in basic amenities like water and sewage disposal.
These were extremely unpleasant living conditions. They were also full of disease and death. More people died in cities than were born in cities for some time. There was an almost very, very high mortality rates in cities. So we have respiratory diseases, TB, constant cholera, a huge problem until, and many cholera epidemics where over 30,000 people would die. The transformation to the factory system also meant that many of the traditional producers of textiles just completely lost their livelihoods, their jobs, and this became the reason for so much resistance to new technology during the Industrial Revolution. This was not just a success story, it was a success story that was achieved against large-scale resistance by much of the laboring population. This was not something that was just acceptable to most people. Now, it might have been a lot more acceptable if they had got wages and jobs out of it. But all they could see was that manufacturers were making big profits out of using these new technologies. So the new technologies were enemies.
Another shortcoming of the Industrial Revolution was the exploitation of children to work in factories.
One of the reasons why these moving parts in the early cotton factories are so small, well, they made it so small so that children could operate the machines. And the child's job was to go around replacing spindles. And so they made it so that a little hand could get in there and work the machine. So you have child labor introduced. Now, there's always been child labor, you would say. Surely a farm is the essence of a farm is child labor. Child labor in a farm, though, is not quite the same thing as child labor in a setting where the factory is closed off. It's often very cold. The air is polluted with cotton fiber. It's vibrating. The sound is deafening. So we think that many of these children must have, if nothing else, come out 5-6 years in the factory with significant hearing loss.
For many families, the price they paid working in these factories was offset by their gains, which were essentially higher incomes and steady work, two things that were previously unattainable. Given a choice between starving and having enough to get by, factory work improved their lives. These living and working conditions were so prevalent that people were led to believe that all industrial cities were the same. But in truth, they weren't. Each was distinctive, and the conditions in them were not as uniformly bad as was often assumed. In time, governments and workers themselves would find ways through legislation and labor organizations to solve the various problems in both the factory and the city. Every historian looks back on the Industrial Revolution with a different perspective. In her book, The Age of Manufactures, Maxine Burr gives a special place to the role that women and children played in the making of the Industrial Revolution.
I also place very special emphasis on transformation across a wide range of industrial sectors in the 18th and 19th centuries. My book is not just about the cotton industry, it is about a wide range of industrial experiences over the course of the century of the Industrial Revolution, and also emphasizes the many different ways in which that industrial transformation took place. It wasn't simply a story of factories and steam power. This is a story of the rapid expansion of many small workshops and the use of a whole range of different types of technologies, different types of power, but all of that being a part of the story of industrialization.
And Professor Margaret Jacob puts forward a connection between those involved in the Industrial Revolution in England and those who played a part in the Enlightenment.
Well, one of the things the Enlightenment did was place emphasis upon the here and the now, upon living in this world, upon the possibility of change and the possibility of progress and reform. And I think that fed into the psychology of the early industrialist, the early entrepreneur, who imagined that he, interestingly enough, it was almost always he and not she, that he was bringing progress to humankind. Now, we might look back at such a person and say, this fellow's a greedy capitalist. He's in there for, making the pound, or we would say the buck. But he saw himself as someone who was bringing progress to society, that transforming industry was going to transform people's lives for the better. Now, having that kind of enlightened rationale, I think, makes it easier to be an industrialist and sleep at night.
Society continues to make demands on human imagination and inventiveness, and progress continues. One thing we can be sure of by studying industrial history is that we know where we've been. And while that's amazing, the awesome truth, as we step into the future, is we have no idea what lies ahead.